A Hebrew slave pushes open the heavy cedar doors of an Egyptian captain's estate in the heat of the day, stepping into a courtyard that is completely, terrifyingly silent. Look at the architecture of a high-ranking military official in the ancient Near East. These estates were small cities. They buzzed with cooks, guards, scribes, and field hands from dawn until dusk. Yet the canonical text leaves a strange, overlooked fragment hanging in the air, a military compound, stripped completely bare of witnesses on a random afternoon. We must uncover what actually happened on that specific day to clear a sprawling estate of every living soul, turning a prolonged psychological stalemate into a violent, physical trap. Genesis 39, 11 inches, the King James Version, sets the scene with a very specific, quiet phrase. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. Stop right there. Read that again. About this time. The English translation softens the edges of the original Hebrew. The phrase carries the weight of a specific, appointed day. A day marked on the calendar, an occasion that broke the normal rhythm of an Egyptian work week. To find out what day that was, we look to an ancient Jewish midrashic text called the Book of Jasher, a historical record mentioned by name twice in the Old Testament. And Jasher reveals exactly why the house was empty. It was the day of the flooding of the Nile, a massive national festival. The entire city of Memphis had emptied out, pouring into the temples of the Egyptian gods by the rushing river. Picture it. The rhythmic chanting echoing in the distance. The streets flooded with citizens offering sacrifices. Every servant, every guard, every maid in Potiphar's household had been given leave to attend the rites. Every servant except one. Jasher records that the wife of the captain feigned a severe illness. She stayed behind, dismissing the last of the remaining staff, waiting in the shadows of the silent corridors. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. I offer it as that, one tradition's record, but it answers the deafening silence of Genesis 39-11. The house did not empty itself by accident. It was emptied by design. She knew the young Hebrew would arrive to do his daily accounts. He would be wearing the fine linen garment of an overseer, the physical fabric of his hard-won survival in a foreign land, a slave who had become a master of the house. The cloak was the proof of his authority. It was also the very thing she intended to rip away. See the scene. Joseph walking down the long stone colonnade, the sunlight cutting through the heavy pillars, the papyrus ledger in his hand, the quiet echoing off the painted floors. He does not know the outer gates have been shut. He does not know the daily war of words is about to end. The festival roars in the distance, masking any sound from the captain's house. Genesis drops us into the climax of the assault, but the canonical text holds the scars of a much longer war. Before the trap in the empty house could be sprung, there was a daily, grinding battle of words and whispers in the open. What exactly had Potiphar's wife been doing to break him down in the months before the day the doors were locked? The shadows in the corridors of Potiphar's house do not move, but the whispers do. Every time the young Hebrew turns a corner, she is waiting. By the grain silos in the heavy heat of the morning, near the cedar ledger tables at noon, at the painted entrance to the inner courts at dusk. The trap on the day of the Nile festival did not materialize from nothing. It was the desperate climax of a war that had been raging in plain sight for months. Listen to the rhythm of Genesis 39-10. And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her, to lie by her, or to be with her. Stop right there, day by day. In English, it sounds like a recurring, petty annoyance, but the Hebrew phrase used here is yom yom, paired with a continuous verb tense. It implies an unbroken, relentless continuum. It was not a series of isolated, whispered invitations. It was a psychological siege designed to break a captive's mind through sheer, grinding attrition. A siege, not a skirmish. To understand the terrifying pressure of this continuum, we open the Testament of Joseph, an ancient Jewish writing preserved in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs. This text was written to record the hidden, internal battles of the sons of Jacob, and it reveals that this was not simply a battle of passing physical lust. It was a calculated, multi-front campaign of psychological terror. Watch what the text does. The Testament records that she did not just offer him a bed, she offered him the entire estate. When flattery failed, she weaponized her tears, weeping openly in the halls, to manipulate a young man whose own grief over his lost family was a fresh, open wound. When weeping failed, she turned to violence. She threatened to have him scourged and beaten in the courtyard. She even whispered in the dark that she would poison Potiphar himself, so that she and Joseph could marry and rule the empire of the house legally. Picture it. A 17-year-old boy, stripped of his name, holding the keys to an Egyptian military fortress, being told he could have the crown if he would only compromise the God of his fathers. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but test it against the psychology of the canonical text. The Hebrew word for the garment he wears, his overseer's cloak, is beged. It shares the exact root consonants with the Hebrew verb bagad, which means to deal treacherously, to commit deceit. Every day, she reached for that garment. Every day, she asked him to turn his covering of authority into an act of profound betrayal. Joseph's defense against this siege was entirely invisible. The Testament of Joseph states that while he oversaw the lavish banquets and the massive food stores of Memphis, he secretly fasted. He starved his flesh so his spirit could survive the onslaught. Surrounded by the wealthiest delicacies of the ancient world, he would eat only bread and water in the quiet of his quarters. 2 hungers, 2 different feasts. He was starving his body to keep his soul intact, while she was feeding her obsession until it consumed her entirely. But an obsession starved of a response does not simply fade away in the silence. It mutates into a public spectacle, a madness that would soon put blades into the hands of the highest-ranking women in Egypt. How far did this obsession spread before the day she finally locked the doors? A woman stands in the painted shadows of an upper balcony, her eyes locked on a Hebrew slave calculating grain yields in the courtyard below. Genesis 39:7 locates the exact origin point of the trap. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." Stop right there. The English says she cast her eyes. The Hebrew text reads Tissa et einaha. She lifted up her eyes. In the linguistic framework of the ancient Near East, this is not a fleeting glance of admiration. It is an idiom of predatory fixation. It is the gaze of a hunter marking prey in the open field. The canonical text leaves this predator nameless, defining her only by her husband's rank. But the Book of Jasher gives the shadow a name, Zelicah, and Jasher records that Zelicah's fixation escalated into a bizarre, theatrical war of fabrics. We know Joseph is anchored by his single beged, the woven cloak of his stewardship. He wears the trust of his master, moving through the house in the uniform of his duty. To break that trust, Jasher says, Zelicah weaponized her own wardrobe. She began changing her garments 3, sometimes 4 times a day. She would wait in the morning light wrapped in the golden silks of an Egyptian priestess. By noon, she would block his path, wearing the sheer, embroidered linens of the royal court. Picture it. The wealthiest woman in the military elite of Memphis, cycling frantically through an empire's worth of jewels and dyed wool, trying to force a slave to lift his eyes from his master's scrolls. One garment, immovable, 100 garments, frantic. Joseph's response in Genesis 39-8 is a masterclass in restraint. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. He does not even address her proposal directly. He points to the house. He points to the master. He makes himself a wall of administrative duty, refusing to even acknowledge the game she is playing. When psychological terror and physical seduction both crashed against that wall of stone, Zelicah's obsession turned inward. The ancient Midrash records that the rejection began to rot her from the inside out. She stopped eating. Her eyes sank into her skull. She became bedridden, her body physically breaking down under the weight of a violent, unanswered lust. I offer this as one tradition's record, but it explains the sudden, terrifying shift in her tactics. When Potiphar stood by her bed and asked what disease was consuming his wife, she claimed a sudden, mysterious pain in her chest. The captain remained entirely blind to the war in his own house. But the elite women of the city were not blind. The aristocratic wives of Memphis heard the whispers of Zelicah's wasting disease and arrived at the estate demanding to see her. Zelicah knew they would mock her if they discovered a Hebrew slave was the cause of her physical ruin, so she did not hide him. She summoned him to serve them, setting a banquet table that would end in blood. An unanswered obsession had driven the captain's wife to the edge of physical starvation. But she was about to prove to the women of Egypt that her madness was completely justified. What exact object did she place in the hands of her wealthy guests moments before Joseph walked into the room? The silver platters hit the painted tables with a heavy, metallic ring. The aristocratic women of Memphis recline on linen cushions in the inner courts, staring at the withered frame of the captain's wife. To prove she has not lost her mind, Zelicah commands a very specific, calculated feast. The Book of Jasher and older Midrashic traditions record the bizarre menu. She places exactly 2 items in the hands of every woman in the room. A citrus fruit, heavy and ripe, and a razor-sharp Egyptian paring knife. Peel the fruit, she tells them. Picture it. A dozen wealthy women, their eyes focused downward, the sharp bronze pressing into the thick rinds. The courtyard is quiet except for the sound of the blades. Genesis 39-6 gives us the missing context for what happens next. The King James text reads, "And Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored." Stop right there. The English sounds like a polite, general compliment, but the Hebrew text is Yefe Tor Vayefe Mare, beautiful in form and beautiful in appearance. It is a striking, extreme, physical description. It is the exact same rare Hebrew phrasing used in Genesis 29 to describe his mother, Rachel. Joseph did not just look like a strong young man. He carried the face of the woman Jacob loved more than life, a beauty that stopped travelers in their tracks. Same face, same curse. At the exact moment the bronze knives bite into the fruit, Zelicah signals for the doors to open. Joseph walks into the banquet hall to change the wine. The women look up from their hands. The sight of the Hebrew slave is so striking, so jarring in its perfection, that their minds completely detach from their physical bodies. The knives slice straight through the fruit and deep into their own flesh. They do not even feel it. Blood pools on the silver platters. The sweet smell of citrus mixes with the heavy copper scent of blood. The women sit paralyzed, staring at the steward, completely unaware that their hands are bleeding out onto the Egyptian silk. Zelicah leans back on her couch, watching the blood drip from their fingers. She speaks into the stunned silence. "If you do this after seeing him for one single moment, what am I to do, who must look upon him every day?" I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. I offer it as that, one tradition's dark memory of the obsession. But it perfectly frames the terrifying reality of the canonical text. The captain's wife was not dealing with a passing whim. She was consumed by a blinding, violent madness. And that madness could no longer be contained in a crowded room. It required absolute isolation. Which brings us back to the day the river flooded, the day the massive estate went entirely silent, the day she finally caught him alone in the corridors. When the heavy cedar doors locked and the psychological war became a physical assault, what tragic piece of his own past was waiting for him in the fabric she grabbed? The heavy cedar doors of the inner chamber are bolted shut. The festival of the flooding Nile roars miles away, leaving the massive estate in a suffocating silence. Joseph steps into the private quarters to retrieve the final ledgers of the day. The captain's wife steps out of the shadows, blocking the only exit, the months of psychological terror, the whispering, the weeping, the painted banquet tables, all of it collapses into a single, violent, physical motion. Genesis 39:12 records the breaking point. And she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got him out. Stop right there. Look closely at what she catches. His garment. The Hebrew word anchoring this verse is beged. Its linguistic root, bagad, means treachery, deceit, a covering that betrays. But the tragedy of this object goes much deeper than its grammar. To understand the absolute terror of this moment, we must look backward to a dry pit in Canaan. Same trauma, same weapon. Years earlier, Joseph's brothers did not merely throw him into a dark cistern. They stripped him of his chitonet, the coat of many colors. They tore away the fabric of his identity, soaked it in the blood of a slaughtered goat, and presented it to his father as false evidence of his destruction. Now, in the dim light of an Egyptian bedroom, history is repeating itself with a terrifying, exact precision. A piece of his clothing is being violently stripped from his body. And just like before, this fabric will be weaponized. It will be held up to a father figure, his master, Potiphar, as false evidence of a horrific crime. 2 garments, 2 betrayals, 2 false verdicts. Picture it. Her hands twisting violently into the thick linen of his stewardship. The physical weight of her pulling him down toward the painted floor. She is not simply holding a piece of cloth. She is gripping his rank, his safety, his entire legally recognized existence in the Egyptian empire. For a slave in the ancient world, to be stripped of your master's livery is to be stripped of your life. If he leaves the beged in her hand, he is a dead man. A naked Hebrew running through the compound of an elite military executioner is a capital offense. He knows exactly what she will do with the cloth. He knows she will use it to frame him. But watch what the text does. He does not negotiate. He does not try to pry her painted fingers off the fabric. He abandons it entirely. He chooses the certain death of his status over the defilement of his soul. He leaves the beged in her hands because a garment of treachery cannot be worn by a man who refuses to betray his God. Reading, not inventing. Yet in that split second, as her grip locked onto his chest and the physical temptation reached its absolute crushing peak, something else happened. The physical strength to run towards certain execution did not materialize out of empty air. Ancient Jewish tradition records that right before he tore himself out of the linen, in the very moment his human resolve was about to fracture under the weight of the assault, Joseph looked up. What exactly did he see hovering in the empty window of that Egyptian chamber that shattered the spell and gave him the supernatural terror to pull away? The linen pulls tight across his back. The air in the locked room is thick with the smell of crushed myrrh and absolute desperation. Joseph's human strength is failing. He is completely isolated, trapped in a foreign architecture, surviving under an unbearable physical and psychological crush. The narrative of Genesis 39 moves rapidly through this struggle, but another chapter in the canonical text slows this exact fraction of a second down. Listen to Genesis 49 to 24. Years later, on his deathbed, Jacob will bless his son and speak of his secret battles. But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. Stop right there. Read that again. Made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. The ancient Hebrew scholars reading this verse stopped and asked a crucial question. When exactly did the hands of Jacob make Joseph strong? His father was hundreds of miles away, mourning in the dust of Hebron, believing his son was dead. To answer this, we open the Talmud. In Tractate Sota 36b, the ancient Jewish rabbis record a profound, terrifying tradition about the exact moment Joseph's will was about to break. The text says that as Potiphar's wife pulled him down, the window of the bedchamber suddenly darkened. Picture it. Joseph looks up from the painted floor, his eyes straining toward the Egyptian light. And hovering in the frame of the window is an apparition, not an Egyptian deity, not a palace god. It is the face of his father. See the scene. The weathered, grieving face of Jacob, projecting across the desert distance, staring directly into the eyes of his lost son at the absolute climax of his temptation. The Talmud records that the image of his father carried a silent, devastating warning. The tradition states that the names of Jacob's sons were destined to be engraved on the onyx stones of the high priest's breastplate, echoing through eternity. But the vision made one thing clear. If Joseph touched this woman, his name would be struck from the stone. He would be erased from the tribes of Israel. He would become just another Egyptian. Same face, same anchor. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. I offer it as that, one tradition's record of a supernatural intervention. But watch what it does to the canonical text. It turns a desperate scramble into a holy terror. The intoxicating spell of the Egyptian chamber shatters. The heavy perfume is replaced by the sudden, piercing memory of the wind in the hills of Canaan. The arms of his hands are made strong by the vision of Jacob. He does not simply slip away, he violently recoils. He rips his body backward with such tremendous force that the heavy linen of the beged is torn from his shoulders. He leaves the false covering of his Egyptian identity dead in her hands because the true identity engraved on his father's heart cannot be abandoned. But breaking the grip of the captain's wife was only the first half of the escape. The doors are still locked. The house is still empty. And now he is completely unspooled, stripped, and exposed deep inside a military fortress. When the heavy doors finally burst open and a Hebrew slave runs half-naked into the burning sunlight of the courtyard, what specific, deadly law of the Egyptian empire has he just triggered? The bronze hinges scream as the heavy cedar doors burst open. The blinding white limestone of the Memphis courtyard hits his eyes. Joseph is running. He does not stop in the corridors. He does not hide in the storerooms he manages. He sprints directly into the burning heat of the Egyptian afternoon, his chest heaving, stripped of his authority and exposed to the open air. Genesis 39:13 locks onto this desperate motion. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth. Stop right there. Look at the Hebrew direction of his flight. Nus hachotza. Nus is the terrifying verb used for fleeing a battlefield, running from a drawn sword. Hachutza means outside, into the streets, beyond the walls of the estate. We read this scene and assume he is running to safety. He is not. In the rigid hierarchy of the ancient Near East, a slave's safety was tied entirely to his uniform. Stripped of his beged, his overseer's cloak, Joseph is no longer the master of the house. He is a naked, foreign captive. And under Egyptian military law, a slave found frantic and exposed, fleeing the inner sanctum of the captain of the guard, would be executed on sight by the first patrol he encountered. Furthermore, without his garments, his circumcision is visible, the physical mark of the Abrahamic covenant, exposing him instantly. As a Hebrew in a culture that the Book of Genesis later states found Hebrews utterly loathsome. Picture it, running into the public streets of an empire without the fabric that proves you have a right to live. He chose the sun. He chose the risk of the spears. Centuries later, a king of Israel would write a terrifying warning about this exact kind of temptation. Proverbs 6:27 asks the question, "Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned?" Joseph understood the fire in that painted bedroom was designed to consume his soul. The only way to escape the fire was to leave the clothes in the flames. I hold this as one reading of the ancient legal context, an understanding of the immense physical risk he took to protect his spiritual purity. He knew the streets of Egypt could kill his flesh, but the bed of Zelekah would assassinate his spirit. He traded a spiritual death for a physical death sentence. See the scene. The blinding light of the empty courtyard on the day of the Nile festival, the frantic footsteps echoing against the stone. The sheer, absolute panic of a 17-year-old boy who has just sacrificed everything he built to keep the name of his father intact. But while Joseph is gasping for air, in the alleys of Memphis, the camera of the canonical text pans back to the dim, heavy silence of the bedroom. The captain's wife is not running. She is standing perfectly still in the shadows. The trap has failed, but the weapon has been secured. She holds the beged in her painted fingers, feeling the weight of the woven linen, listening to the distant roar of the returning festival crowds. The empty house is about to be filled with the men of the guard, and she has the one piece of evidence required to send a Hebrew slave to the executioner's block. How does the torn fabric she holds in her hand suddenly shift from a symbol of his destruction into the undeniable proof of his divine preservation? Go back now to the heavy cedar doors where this film began. The silent courtyard, the empty estate on the day of the Nile festival. You have read this story 100 times as a simple morality tale of a young man fleeing a sudden temptation. But tonight, that empty house is not a random backdrop. It is the site of a brutal, months-long psychological siege, and the silence inside it is no longer the silence of a trap. It is the silence of a terrifying, costly victory. In the shadows of the upper chamber, the captain's wife still stands holding the beged. Genesis 39:16 records her final, venomous act, and she laid up his garment by her until his lord came home. Stop right there. She treats the fabric like a weapon, preserving it carefully until Potiphar returns from the roaring festival. When the captain finally walks through the doors, she holds up the torn linen as absolute physical proof of the Hebrews' violence. But watch what the canonical text does. It is forcing us to look at a devastating parallel. Years earlier, at the edge of a dry pit in Canaan, 10 brothers held up a torn, ruined garment to their father to prove that Joseph was dead. Now, in the painted halls of Memphis, an Egyptian woman holds up a torn, ruined garment to her husband to prove that Joseph is wicked. 2 coats, 2 false verdicts. His brothers stripped him of his sonship. Zelekah stripped him of his stewardship. Both times, the tearing away of his physical covering was meant to destroy him completely. But here is the profound reversal. Zelekah thought she had violently exposed him. In reality, She had only stripped away his Egyptian disguise. By leaving the beged, the garment whose very root word means treachery, dead in her hands, Joseph proved that his soul could not be bought by the empire. The very fabric she presented to the world as evidence of his sin was actually the absolute, undeniable proof of his purity. I hold this as one reading, not the final word. But it transforms the torn cloak from a tragic loss into a towering monument of resistance. We know exactly how he survived the locked room. We know what face hovered in the window to give him the supernatural terror to pull away. But the text leaves a massive, glaring shadow untouched. Potiphar is the captain of the guard. He is the chief executioner of the Egyptian military. By law, a slave who attempts to defile a noblewoman does not go to a holding cell. He is executed in the courtyard before the sun sets. Yet Genesis tells us Potiphar merely puts him in the king's prison, keeping him alive. Did the executioner look at his wife's frantic eyes, look at the torn beged, and quietly recognize the lie? The canonical text goes completely silent. The damp stone walls of the subterranean prison are still holding the rest of that mystery. If you walked through the empty house with us today, comment the word "watched" below, subscribe to the channel, so we can keep uncovering the lost context of our scriptures, and send this to one person who loves the story of Joseph, but has never heard what actually happened behind those locked cedar doors. He lost his covering, but the fire never touched his soul.